So our industry, like all industries, started simple. And now it's an incredibly complicated world. We have very complicated financial instruments. We have sophisticated risk management systems and a significant regulatory and compliance scrutiny that's applied on top of that. And all of this is instrument specific, or at the very least, instrument class specific. And this means that we've migrated to a situation where it's almost impossible to find somebody in a financial services institution who can actually understand all of the different information flows and all of the different technology systems that support this very complicated business estate. Now, this is a problem because technology has a shelf life. Languages age, they are replaced by more powerful languages, more efficient languages, and architectures age as well. We've been talking now for several years about when and where it's appropriate to replace monolithic architectures with microservices, for example. So today's cutting edge solution becomes tomorrow's technology problem and overhead. And this isn't just a question, as we know, about an IT wish list and wanting to play with the latest and greatest. This is something which actually has a cost impact, a revenue impact, and an operational risk impact. Now, traditionally, we think about legacy technology estates having a drag on our businesses in terms of cost. And if you look at the left-hand side of the diagram, this talks about the major cost programs that banks have implemented. And all banks have implemented these programs. However, cost to income ratios have either remained stagnant or have actually worsened in the vast majority of cases. So it's a real failure for legacy technology estate programs to achieve the results that they want. But it's important to remember that even though we focus on cost, there are revenue impacts here as well. And if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, what this shows is that those banks which are digital banks, which are banks that have either already addressed their legacy technology estate or more likely are digital native, those banks have a much better ratio of operating expenses to assets under management. So for that, what that really means is that for every dollar of cost, they can manage more assets and by implication generate more revenue. So legacy technology estates are having a significant impact on different financial institutions' ability to do business. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, one of the reasons that we've really been very slow to address these estates within our industry is that these projects tend to get shelved during boom times. The focus obviously shifts into taking advantage of the current market situation, and quite often the funding and the available staff to work on legacy technology problems gets deprioritized. And we've just had a boom time. The pandemic gave this industry quite a lot of relief. We saw an increase in market volatility, which increased trading revenues as people responded to the COVID impact. But obviously, that has now decreased. Originally, we saw a lot of loan loss provisions. But then as we started to become aware of the magnitude of state intervention, those aggressive loan loss provisions were written down, again, providing a reprieve in our industry. And we've also seen an enormous liquidity injection by governments and central banks, which has helped us as well. But outside of our industry, the real economy has significantly suffered. And this is now starting to have a knock-on impact to financial services as well. You know, those liquidity injections have started to compress net interest margin available to banks, for example. And if you look at GDP predictions for next year, for 2022, there's only one major economy which is expected to grow compared to pre-pandemic levels, and that's China, which is a GDP growth predicted of 2%, which is not great for China. Compared to the US, -4%, the Eurozone, -8%, and the UK at -10%, although there obviously have been other impacts in the UK as well. So a pandemic has provided a temporary relief to the industry, but that's now fading fast. And it will be those organizations that have managed to maintain a focus on reducing their legacy drag on their business that will be best positioned to tackle the challenges ahead. So this now comes to our first poll question, which is, have you experienced a deprioritization of legacy modernization projects during the pandemic? And I believe there's 3 answers available. yes, it's been entirely deprioritized in favor of revenue focus, or yes, there's been some deprioritization, or no, the focus on legacy modernization projects has been maintained. And we can take a look at those poll results at the end and discuss what they mean for our organizations. Can we move to the next slide, please? So it's important also to remember that there are different approaches to legacy modernization projects, even within our industry. Now, there's certain things which we all have in common in terms of increased business expectations or heightened regulatory scrutiny, but there are certain differences as well. So if we look at capital markets, and we look at sell-side and buy-side firms, and we look at the way that technology teams tend to focus on legacy modernization projects, within the sell side, we often talk to, within Luxoft, we often talk to clients who talk about time to market issues. So they're worried about how long it takes to get a business requirement into production. Now, what this really means is that the focus is on optimizing legacy estates in the first instance and then reducing them, scaling them down in the second instance, which means there's an increased focus on bringing modern techniques onto legacy platforms like continuous integration, continuous deployment, DevOps, QA automation, etc. On the buy side, technology teams tend to talk more about revenues and margins. And what this really means is that they're worried very much about that cost drag on the business that legacy technology provides. So therefore, the conversation there and the focus there is first on reducing and scaling down the estate, and secondarily on optimizing the elements which can't be scaled down immediately. So there's different priorities there, but there's also different limitations, although they add up to very much the same thing. On the sell side, for example, historically, IT has prioritized the cost elements, and there's been huge cost programs. There's been, a lot of offshoring, there's been a lot of downsizing, there's been a lot of removal of operations teams in favor of robotic process automation. And the whole mantra there was, let's do more with less. But when it comes to legacy technology projects, you actually need spare capacity above and beyond the normal business work to address the legacy technology program. So with legacy technology projects, you end up doing less with less. On the buy side, it's a slightly different perspective again. So buy-side technology teams quite rightly pride themselves on being lean organizations full of technical wizards. And that's fantastic. Again, what it means is that the organization is right-sized for the here and now, and that additional resource capacity needs to be introduced in order to address legacy. So same problem, different approaches, different historical reasons for getting there. So again, another poll question. So this one is, does your organization actually have the spare capacity to address legacy technology estates? And there's 4 potential answers here. So yes, dedicated teams are available, or yes, there are funding provisions. Alternatively, yes, but only on an exception basis, or no, that capacity is not there or is only marginally there. And again, we can review those answers at the end of this session. So moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So legacy technology estates that we discussed are typically thought of in terms of cost and time to market. So we get a set of sort of typical approaches as a result of that. We move platform operations offshore. We apply DevOps, CI/CD onto existing legacy technology estates wherever possible. It's not always possible. And we migrate to the cloud. But quite often that really means migrating the existing system onto a dedicated host in the cloud, which obviously gives you some cost relief, it gives you CapEx relief, turns that into OpEx expenses, but again, it's not giving you all the benefits. But as we discussed, we can't think of legacy technology only as a cost and a time to market problem. It's also a revenue issue, and it's also an operational risk. So we actually need consolidated approaches which simplify the entire stack. And there are challenges with that, because it means within an organization, we need to agree what needs to be decommissioned. We need to ensure there are no business impacts, and we need to phase the program to spread the costs, because typically legacy technology programs are designed with large upfront costs and return on investment far down the line, which really isn't palatable. And finally, we need to transition the workforce to a new way of working. So what we see is that there are three success factors for getting this right. And organizations that focus on these tend to be more successful in modernizing and digitizing their legacy estates. The first is incremental planning approach, so that change can be accelerated or decelerated based on market pressures and other prioritizations internally. The second is choosing the right partners and platforms so that you have the right end state to get to and the right people to help you get there. And finally, it's about re-architecting, not just migrating to the cloud, but actually re-architecting to the cloud. And when organizations follow these three principles, then not only do they see the full benefits of removing legacy estates, but they also see a better return on their typical approaches. Can we move to the last slide, please? So that's it. So hopefully that was of interest, and maybe we can take a look at some of the poll questions and do some Q&A. Okay, so this was the question about, thank you, Andy. Oh, is this the first one or the second one? Okay, well, let's do this one. Has your organization experienced a deprioritization of legacy modernization projects during the pandemic? Majority is saying yes, either entirely or in some way. And as we say, this is typical. There's a boon, the focus shifts elsewhere. And really then the question becomes about that incremental approach. Have you managed to plan in such a way that you can keep it ticking in the background and re-accelerate it once the business interest returns? So yeah, very typical of what we would expect. And the next one. Okay, does your organization have the spare capacity to address legacy technology? So interestingly, it's about 50-50 here. You know, well, a little bit less actually. So about 40% of people either have dedicated teams or funding provisions. And I think this is because, you know, as technologists, we've been banging this drum for a long time now, and we've really educated our business in how important this is to them, and they are very sort of aware of that fact. It's a shame to see that there are so many situations where it has to be done on an exception basis, or it's not really done at all. This is a never-ending housekeeping task, and it needs to be performed. And it's quite typical to see a response like this, but it's something that we need to address. Thanks, Andy.
Very good, thank you, Nathan. We've got a few questions come in on Slido for you. First one that popped up immediately was, will you be making these slides available to attendees? They are great. So I would take that as a vote of confidence in the slide presentation. There's a couple of actual questions here. How would you address funding challenges for modernization projects? Perhaps that gets some way to the result of the last poll.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there's these challenges because of the waxing and waning of interest in doing this because of the changes in the market. There's also the problem of the upfront investment that's often required, you know, if you take a very sort of straightforward planning approach. So what we're starting to see is there's a lot of organizations now interested in partnering with professional services firms and finding mutually beneficial funding solutions. There's a lot of interesting ways that you can start to share risk and cost and start to spread and flatten that cost over time to make the investment much more predictable and the returns come earlier. So when we're having conversations with more senior technologists, you know, the sort of CIO -1 levels, this is often the conversation that comes up, which is what sort of venture can we create together to address these challenges?
So it's about thinking outside the box. It's not just a simple like come in, fix our issue and go away. It's something a little more creative, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you talking sort of multi-year approaches really to these problems?
Very good. Another question. What are your views on the extent to which budgets and modernization initiatives will be driven by climate change? And will that be a catalyst for rapid transformation as COVID was for digital channels?
Interesting. It's an interesting question. I think in terms of sort of the environmental impact of everybody hosting their own data centers, both in terms of the provisioning of those resources in an inefficient way, and also of the sort of the infrastructure that goes around it. And it's a topic I know a little bit about because I started off building data centers for my sins. It's definitely something that we'll see a reduction of. I don't think there's any organization starting now that really needs to be fully hosted in their own data center anymore. And most digital native organizations, as we know, are fully cloud. So I think it will drive a lot of change. And once you start to migrate your existing applications onto those dedicated hosts, well, that's the sort of easy step. And then it gets back into the re-architecture and the further optimization, which again should see a further reduction in environmental impact.
And I think you sort of answered this final question from Slido, which says, do you see a trend in how organizations are choosing to address legacy technology estates? Clearly, cloud has a role to play in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, cloud is often pitched, it has a lot of benefits, but the one that's pitched, very aggressively is get rid of your CapEx costs, transfer them to an operational expense. And I think we're sort of seeing that similar approach, which is if there's something that we are doing that does not provide us a competitive advantage, why are we doing it? I'd be surprised to find a financial institution that's building, for example, an enterprise data management system from scratch. We used to do that, 10, 15 years ago, but why not just take one of those systems off the shelf? And the same is coming true with everything, including trading systems. It's much better to take your competitive advantage, which is your models, and put them into a third-party system where you're not responsible for updating the underlying architecture and sort of languages used, where you can treat it as an operational expense if you purchase it in the right way. So this move to outsourcing what is not of advantage to you is the big trend that we see.
Very good. Last question from me, Nathan. You mentioned sort of outsourcing and getting outside help. Can you talk us through how teams can work together with outside help and how sort of knowledge transfer can happen? I think that can be something that people worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. Knowledge transfer is always a concern. And if you're sort of going to outsource something wholesale, knowledge management is a big problem. And I think that's the difference, is that it's not something you can think about at the end of the project. It can't just be about the transfer. It's got to be about the management throughout that project. There should never be a time when you are scrambling to document what's happened and handing it over at the last minute. You really need to have somebody, an organization, that has very firm knowledge management principles embedded in their culture and the way they operate. And this is the real value that professional services firms can provide if they have that culture.
Very good. Okay. Well, look, we're out of time. Nathan, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I've got a message that the slides have been added to the resources section on the platform. So that's where you'll find those. Thanks for sharing, Nathan. Fabulous session.